How Blaise Compaoré betrayed Thomas Sankara, from friend to murderer. 27 years on, yet Thomas Sankara's legacy endures. Sankara was a wise leader who cherished his native Burkina Faso. He would not, however, live long enough to see his vision come true and improve his nation. An assassin killed him. In this video, you will learn about Sankara's life and how his principles have persisted in the minds of the younger generation who are now trying to revive the nation's political and economic standing. You will also learn how Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's brother and friend, betrayed him. Who is Sankara? Thomas Sankara was born December 21, 1949 in Yako, Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso. He was a military officer and proponent of Pan-Africanism who was installed as president of Upper Volta in 1983 after a military coup. He held that position until 1987. Sankara chose to join the military despite his parents' wishes, who were Roman Catholics, that he'd become a priest. Sankara, at 20 years old, was sent to Madagascar for officer training in 1970, where he observed a student and worker movement that led to the overthrow of the government of Madagascar. Sankara spent time in France studying at a parachute academy before returning to Upper Volta in 1972, when he was further exposed to left-wing political ideas. For his bravery in the border conflict with Mali in 1974, he attracted a lot of public notoriety. Nevertheless, years later, he would declare the conflict pointless and unjust. Sankara's reign as president was from 1982 to 1987. Sankara, a charismatic army captain, came to power in Burkina Faso in 1983 in a popularly supported coup. He immediately launched the most ambitious program for social and economic change ever attempted on the African continent. A succession of puppet leaders kept the nation under France's neo-colonial rule, while the majority of Upper Volta's people continued to be uneducated and undernourished. To symbolize this rebirth, he even renamed his country from the French colonial Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of upright men. As soon as he took office, he reduced the salaries of all public servants, including his own, and forbade the use of chauffeur-driven Mercedes and first-class airline tickets. Like many revolutionary leaders, he banned unions, a free press, and anything which might stand in the way of his plans for the immediate and radical transformation of society. Burkina Faso was plagued by poverty when Sankara took office as president in 1983. Although only 10% of the population was literate and infant mortality was high, he had a new perspective. He then developed a new plan that called for everyone to eat 2 meals daily and drink 10 liters of water. In order to restore that sense of responsibility, Sankara implemented a socialist, anti-imperialist agenda aimed at cultivating a self-sufficient economy run by the Burkinabe people, for the Burkinabe people. His agenda included, among other things, refusal to pay Burkina Faso's debts to Western-run institutions on the grounds that 1. It was illegitimately accrued, and 2. Constant debt serving was anathema to African development. Captain Thomas Sankara can be recognized for being instrumental in reviving that post-colonial enthusiasm that people had hoped would be rekindled by Mugabe's Zimbabwe, but was not. The enthusiasm that cleared bushes, built thousands of miles of modern roads, dug canals on the basis of free labor and the spirit of nation building. Despite having a laid-back personality and modest morals, Sankara advocated for an expansive development agenda for the African continent. First, he changed the name of his nation from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, and nationalized most of its resources, especially its agricultural and mineral resources. He organized a number of commando operations to construct a railroad that would connect the entire country. The populace built almost 100 kilometers of railway in 2 years, increased literacy in the countryside, tens of thousands were taught to read, and immunized children against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever. 2 million children were vaccinated in 2 weeks, saving 18,000 to 50,000 kids who usually died in the yearly epidemics. None of these initiatives received funding from foreign financial institutions, and none were supported. on a continent where starvation and thirst were imposed on entire peoples by the financial institutions and foreign policy. Goals of the civilized Western world, Sankara's purpose was to guarantee the population's access to food and clean drinking water. This was a simple but challenging desire. Our economic goal, he declared, is to use Burkinabe to make sure that everyone has access to 2 meals per day and clean water. His policies were successful. The production of grain increased by 75% between 1983 and 1986, and the new Ministry of Water assisted numerous towns in drilling wells and building water reservoirs. According to journalist Ernest Harsh, ordinary Burkinabe appeared to effortlessly embrace Sankara's strategy, as people rallied in his local villages to swiftly create new schools, health clinics, and other institutions that had before seemed just a remote fantasy. The Europeans, and especially the French, turned against the revolutionary government as a result of Sankara's independent development programs and non-aligned foreign policy, which saw him maintain cordial ties with Cuba, Libya, and the Soviet Union. Similar to other revolutionary movements in Cuba and Venezuela, Sankara's government was successfully implementing a new approach to development that rejected the racial paternalism and interventionist austerity of Western financial institutions in favor of a self-sufficiency model based on mass mobilization. Sankara also wanted to be respected by the global North, particularly by Burkina Faso's former colonizer. What's crucial, he said, is to build a partnership of equals mutually beneficial, without paternalism on either side or an inferiority mentality on the other. "We don't want anything from anyone," said Foreign Minister Bassirou Guissou. "No one will come to develop Burkina Faso in place of its people." At a time when Africa's debt was around $200 billion and 40% of the continent's export earnings were going toward debt payments, this was a brave stance to take. Sankara went one step further when, in 1987, he urged the rest of Africa to reject its foreign debt and follow Burkina Faso's successful model of self-sufficiency. During his time in power, Sankara's relationship with the French government deteriorated. For instance, France provided Mali with firearms in 1985 during a brief border conflict with Burkina Faso. Overall, Sankara had reduced French influence in West Africa, and if his alternative strategy was successful, other populations in the area would likely come to believe that self-sufficiency was attainable, further reducing French influence. Since many Burkinabe exiles who opposed the Burkinabe Revolution lived in Félix Houphouët-Boigny's country, the French maintained tight ties with the conservative leaders of the neighboring countries of Togo and Côte d'Ivoire. When Sankara visited Côte d'Ivoire in May 1984, he was initially barred from entering Abidjan, the country's main city, because Ivorian officials were concerned he would be welcomed more enthusiastically than the country's own president. Following the end of the 1974 Agadir Strip border battles between Upper Volta and Mali, Kampara was stationed north of Ouahikuia. There he met Thomas Sankara, with whom he formed a strong connection. Kampara served as Minister of State during the presidency 1983-87, thereby placing him second in command of the government, as well as Minister of State for Justice 1985-87. Kampara, who was quiet and self-effacing, was prepared to leave the public business of politics in Upper Volta, renamed Burkina Faso in 1984, to the more charismatic Sankara and the other two coup architects. That changed in 1987, when conflicts over security and other strategic concerns allegedly sparked an October 15 coup led by Kampara, Zongo, and Lingani that brought Kampore to power. The fall of the hero. Everything came crashing down on October 15, 1987, when former Sankara comrade Blaise Compaoré staged his own coup. His men assassinated Sankara and his closest associates and buried their bodies in an unmarked mass grave. When word of Sankara's death spread, mourners came to the mound to lay flowers and grieve, according to Harsh. This period saw the establishment of a new dictatorship with new policies for the people of Burkina Faso. Compaoré not only assassinated Sankara, but also betrayed him by rejecting the path of leadership that Sankara had chosen. This was sufficient grounds for the charges to escalate, as Campori consistently disputed the claims leveled against him. In exchange, France compensated Blaise for removing the guy who was viewed as a major impediment to France's strategy and influence in the region. They compensated him nicely. Blaise has since become one of the most popular guests at the Élysée Palace, as well as one of the world's wealthiest presidents. Africans, on the other hand, will never forget one of their most devoted sons. As Africa desperately seeks leaders of integrity and vision, the late Thomas Sankara's life and ideas appear to become more important and exemplary with the passing of time. Sankara is still revered in Africa in the same way that Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, and Steve Biko are, and in the same way that Che Guevara is revered worldwide. The rise of Blaise Compaoré, 1987 to 2014. Blaise Compaoré, born February 3, 1951, in Ouagadougou, Upper Volta, French West Africa, now Burkina Faso. He was a military leader and politician who ruled Burkina Faso from 1987, seizing power following a coup. He resigned on October 31, 2014, following days of violent protest. Compaoré was born into a Mossi family, one of Upper Volta's prominent ethnic groupings, and raised in the town of Ziniri, near Ouagadougou. In Yaoundé, Cameroon, he attended military college, and in Rabat, Morocco, he underwent para-commando training. From 1978 until 1981, he was a section commander and eventually a company commander in an Upper Volta para-commando regiment. In 1981, Compaoré was given the head of the National Commando Training Center at Po. In 1982, he became deeply involved in national politics when his friend and colleague, Captain Thomas Sankara, resigned from his government post to protest policy decisions. When another power struggle saw Sankara imprisoned a year later, Compaoré rallied the commando unit at Po and conducted a coup on August 4, 1983, that placed Sankara as president. Compaoré led Burkina Faso into a strong partnership with France, which maintains tight political, security, and economic ties with several of its former African colonies. Some of his first moves included ending the state monopoly on mining and allowing the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to return to the country. "We must appeal to private investors without shame," he declared, breaking with Sankara. "We must advance capitalism. We have never thought about socialism." Unlike his predecessor, Compaoré erected an expensive presidential mansion and purchased a luxury airplane once owned by Michael Jackson. The West's quick support for Compaoré, as well as the new leader's ties to France, especially French ally Félix Houphouët-Boigny, have fueled speculation that the coup was staged at the request of Burkina Faso's old colonizer. The French government still refuses to reveal its archives on Sankara. Foreign exploration teams identified vast gold reserves in Burkina Faso during the late 1990s. Canada, with its rising gold interests, was particularly intrigued. Axeman, Orezone Resources, Etruscan Resources, St. Jude Resources, SEMAFO, and High River Gold were among the Canadian businesses exploring or developing mines in Burkina Faso by 2003. Within less than 2 decades, Canadian interests would control the majority of gold operations in the country, thereby monopolizing Burkina Faso's most profitable product. Compaoré presided over the new regime, which prioritized economic liberalization and eventually limited democratic change. Zongo and Lingani had key positions in the dictatorship until 1989, when they were accused of plotting against Compaoré and executed, freeing Compaoré to pursue his own agenda. With the adoption of a new constitution in 1991, multi-party politics were reintroduced and a presidential election was held later that year. Compaoré, who resigned from the military to run for president as a civilian, was elected to a 7-year term. However, he ran unchallenged since opposition candidates boycotted the election in protest of Compaoré's reluctance to hold a national conference on political reform. He was re-elected in 1998 in an election boycotted once more, although this time by only the major opposition candidates. He was also re-elected in 2005 and 2010. In the years following Compaore's ascension to power, he faced a difficult task in overcoming his reputation as the murderer of Sankara, who had attracted a sizable following throughout Western Africa, and in the 1990s, Compaore was accused of involvement in civil conflicts in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Angola. He did, however, become a renowned regional leader who frequently mediated disagreements in neighboring Western African countries. He was also the chairman of several regional organizations, including the Organization of African Unity, predecessor to the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and the West African Economic and Monetary Union. In 2014, a popular movement deposed Compaore, bringing an end to decades of blatantly neocolonial administration. However, the political process that followed failed to break with the past, as Sankara would have advocated. Canadian pressure was important in preventing significant reform. According to Business Monitor Online, Burkina Faso is significantly dependent on international aid, much of it from Canada, the home jurisdiction of most of the miners who would be harmed by significant review. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper further shielded Canadian investments by concluding a Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement, FIPA, signed with the Compaore administration while the unelected transition government was in office. Marc-Christian Kabary exposed the country's persistent reliance on Canadian investment. As Canadian mining investments in Burkina Faso and throughout West Africa increased, Kabary shook Trudeau's hand and understood the value of Canadian investments to the Burkinabe economy. No other African leader, and very few leaders in the rest of the world, brought as extreme change and were as revolutionary as Burkina Faso's Lion King Thomas Sankara. He was really imaginative and inventive, and he was the most incorruptible of men. Those who do not want to see such autonomous leadership and inventiveness in Africa, however, could not allow it, and thus Sankara had to be removed. Few dispute that it was none other than the current dictator of Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's closest friend and confidant, who personally executed or ordered his assassination. Decades later, in 2021, 14 persons were ultimately accused in connection with Sankara's death, including Compaoré. He refused to participate in the proceedings and, having been in exile in Côte d'Ivoire since 2014, would be tried in absentia. The long-awaited trial was held by a military tribunal and began on October 11, later that year. When the decision was released on April 6, 2022, Compaoré and 9 others were found guilty of being involved in Sankara's death, while one, Hyacinthe Kafando, was convicted guilty of the murder. Compaoré, Kafando, and another defendant, General Gilbert Diendéré, were sentenced to life in prison, while 8 other accused received lower penalties. 3 of the accused were acquitted. We've come to the end of the video. What are your thoughts? Drop them in the comment section below. We bring to you more knowledge and hidden truths about Africa. Subscribe to our channel to get more updates on our topics. See you in our next video.